fantasy exec is here. Corey Parson filling in for Joe Ostrowski all week on BetQL Daily. And he's here to help you break down position by position what you should be looking for in your fantasy drafts. Tight end, I mentioned it a couple minutes ago, Corey. It's a different position, it feels like, than it was even just 4 or 5 years ago when it was basically get Kelce or Andrews, and if you can't get them, wait a while and you'll find somebody in the middle of the draft. Now, you've got Kelce, obviously. You've got Sam LaPorta. You've got Andrews there as well. Trey McBride, who we mentioned the other day, had a big year for the Cardinals last year. You've got Kincaid in Buffalo, who's going to, you would think, continue to absorb targets with Stephon Diggs leaving the Bills. There's a larger top tier, it feels like. Or would you kind of break those top 4 or 5 off into a couple different directions too?
I think you break them off into a couple of different directions. Now, when you get ready for your drafts, right, it's a lot of different ways that people like to attack the tight end. Some people like to get one of the top guys early in the draft and, say, okay, well, I got an advantage against my opponent every week at the tight end position. And then you got guys that like to stream tight ends. Now, the streaming tight end thing, I've done a lot because sometimes in the draft, I get so enamored with picking off wide receivers and running backs that I look up and, oh my God, it's Tyler Conklin. You don't want to get that far playing tight end chicken. Now, when you look at the tight ends, it's 2 things that really stand out: touchdowns and targets. Touchdowns and targets. I'm always going to go to the side of the targets because the targets are more predictable than the touchdowns are. And this year, particularly, the way drafts are lining up, I think I'm going to get my tight ends a little bit earlier. Now, when you get into your draft and you start to do your fantasy research, you say, okay, well, Travis Kelce, top tight end in football, let's go, hands down, forget about it. Not necessarily the case no more, particularly not the case no more, because I got Sam LaPorta for the Detroit Lions. It's the top tight end in fantasy football going into this season. Not only does he give you an elite target number on a great offense, he also is a guy that we've seen have a nose for the goal line, where he scored 10 touchdowns last year, caught 86 balls, 120 targets. Actually, in PPR scoring, he was tight end 1. Now, when you look at fantasy points per game, he was just behind Travis Kelce. Kelce coming in at 14.6, LaPorta coming in at 14.1. But, Kelce also is still an elite target guy with 121 targets. Them tight ends, those touchdowns, dropped to 5 last year. And listen, Travis Kelce is not a young man. Travis Kelce is an older player, and he is going to hit the wall at some point. We started to see signs of that last year. So my tight end 1, and I have 2 elite tight ends, is Sam LaPorta and is Travis Kelce, and that's where I would start. LaPorta, probably round 3, Kelce, round 4. But if you want LaPorta, he's going like on that 3-4 turn. So you're going to have to pay a premium to get who I think is the top tight end in fantasy football.
All right, let me come around then. There's 2 ways I can go with this. I want to get back to targets in a second because it sends us in a different direction. But let me talk about, again, looking back at the way that top tier used to be constructed before LaPorta inserted himself into the conversation, when Mark Andrews was a part of that conversation just behind Travis Kelce, and when maybe we were talking George Kittle sometimes too. With Andrews and Kittle both. Andrews last year specifically, Kittle as well, but Kittle now a couple seasons. You're talking about injuries always being a part of the conversation and availability being the biggest part of this with Andrews and Kittle. Are they still on that second tier? Or, we talked about docking receivers for the quarterback they might be playing with. Are we docking some of these tight ends now because of injury issues that have popped up more consistently in Kittle's case, especially?
All right, so Andrews and Kittle are in tier 2 of my tight ends, along with Trey McBride and Evan Ingram. Now, these players have minimal question marks, but let's start with Mark Andrews, who has really been the focal point for the majority of his career of the Baltimore Ravens passing attack. One thing that we know about Lamar Jackson likes to throw the football inside the numbers. He works in the seam, he works in the middle of the field, and that's where Mark Andrews does a lot of his work at. But now we're starting to see last year with Zay Flowers started to get some of that middle of the field work. I actually think Zay Flowers is going to be the top receiving option in that Ravens passing game this year. Andrews getting a little bit older, dealing with too many injuries, he is going to miss time. Now, Andrews is still a good player, solid option at tight end. If you leave your draft with Andrews, you also need to leave your draft with Isaiah Likely, the backup, because Likely is going to play this year. He could play with Andrews healthy, but he's definitely going to play when Andrews gets injured, and he is going to fit right into that role. He's a player that Lamar Jackson can trust. When it comes to George Kittle, it's interesting. Kittle is in an offense with a lot of mouths to feed. But if you consider Brandon Ayuk could be gone for that offense, one thing we like about Kittle, Chris, he's not the biggest target guy, but he has a
Mm-hmm.
nose for the end zone, scored 6 touchdowns last season, only 90 targets, 65 catches, did give you over 1,000 yards, an elite yard per catch number over 15, but 6 touchdowns really helped his fantasy value as those targets aren't there. And McBride and Ingram are target guys. With Ingram, people are going to be skeptical, right? Because Ingram has been so bad for so many years. So his first good year, you're going to go back to him, and you're seeing him as a guy that drops in drafts lower than he should.
Corey Parson has given us a breakdown, the fantasy exec, as he fills in for Joe Ostrowski this week on the tight end position ahead of your fantasy football drafts. So I wanted to come back around to targets. You mentioned one of the guys I was going to bring up because he led the league in targets at tight end last year in Evan Ingram. You got him on the second tier, right? I guess my question with Ingram would be, why is he on that second tier rather than the first tier based on targets? Is it the quarterback? Is it what else Jacksonville may have added in the receiving game? And then you go down to number 3 in targets. I'm going to remove TJ Hawkinson from the conversation because of the ACL injury. We're not sure when he's going to be back. Mm-hmm. But I go to David Njoku in Cleveland, 3rd in targets at the tight end position last year. Tell me why Ingram and Njoku don't appear as high in your tiers or your rankings as maybe the target share would indicate they should.
So let's start with Ingram. Ingram is this going to be consistent? We saw terrible years with the New York Giants, where he always was talked about as he's going to be this big top tight end, this stud, elite athleticism. And for the 6 years, 5 years he was in New York, it never really panned out. Fantasy managers, fantasy owners are very romantic. So if you do them dirty, they're more likely not to go back to you. So the ADP drop, he got to Jacksonville. Last year, he had 114 catches on 143 targets. Now, Calvin Ridley wasn't the player they thought he was going to be. Now, Brian Thomas Jr. could be that guy. So I think the skepticism with Ingram is, okay, is he going to do it again, or am I going to waste another draft pick chasing these stats? So that's what the problem is, in my opinion, with Ingram. With Njoku, is quarterback play and is lack of consistency. But those two guys, right, you can feel comfortable leaving your draft with those two guys. They're not elite, but you're not going to be embarrassed going up against your opponent the next week.
So let me ask you this. If we get, let's say it happens where, like you mentioned this earlier off the top, like, I don't value tight end early. I'm not going to go out of my way because I want to make sure I got a top tier wide receiver, and maybe the draft falls that I get a quarterback early, and I filled out tight end, or excuse me, I filled out wide receiver with a couple, and I've got a running back, I got a quarterback, I feel good about things, and I look up and like the top 5, 6 tight ends, 7 maybe are off the board. And there's been a run on tight ends, and I missed it. Where's some value down the board that I can find when I'm scratching and fighting and clawing for a tight end?
Let's go to the great state of Texas, where you got 2 tight ends, one in Dallas, one in Houston, that I think could be dudes that you can get probably in like that 8, 9, 10 round. Jake Ferguson was an excellent target for Dak Prescott last year. One of the few Cowboys that actually went out there and played with heart throughout most of the season last year. And I think those reps for him are going to go up. Dallas has no running game. I could see Jake Ferguson and short passing across the middle for Dak Prescott, that becoming the Dallas Cowboys rushing attack this year. And Ferguson also has a nose for the end zone. He's going to be a guy that Dak Prescott looks for in the red zone. So Ferguson last year had 5 touchdowns. He had over 100 targets, 71 catches. Same thing goes for Dalton Schultz. He had 5 touchdowns last year as well for the Houston Texans. Now, the target number wasn't elite with only 88 targets, but 59 catches, 10 yards of reception, solid guys that you can get and for your fantasy draft. And don't forget about Kyle Pitts. Kyle Pitts is going to be there too under a new system this year. Give Kyle Pitts one more shot.